the shadows whisper of an organization so ancient, so powerful, that its very name sends chills down the spines of historians and conspiracy theorists alike. Picture this. While civilizations rose and crumbled, while empires conquered and fell, one secret society has allegedly pulled the strings from behind the curtain for over 3,000 years. They've been blamed for everything from the fall of Rome to the French Revolution, from the assassination of presidents to the manipulation of global markets. But here's the thing that'll keep you awake tonight. What if they're still operating today? Welcome to the mystery that governments don't want you to investigate, the truth that powerful families have spent fortunes to bury, and the revelation that could change everything you thought you knew about how our world really works. I'm your guide through this labyrinth of secrets, and tonight, we're diving into the truth behind the world's oldest secret society. But before we descend into this rabbit hole together, let me ask you something that's going to haunt you for the next 40 minutes. Have you ever wondered why certain symbols appear carved into ancient temples in Egypt, etched into medieval cathedrals in Europe, and somehow end up printed on the dollar bill in your wallet? Have you ever questioned why the same mysterious rituals described in text from ancient Babylon are still being performed in modern boardrooms and political chambers? And most importantly, have you ever considered that the history you learned in school might be nothing more than a carefully crafted story designed to hide the real puppet masters of human civilization? Those questions aren't random curiosities. They're breadcrumbs leading to a truth so explosive that entire libraries have been purged to keep it hidden. Because what I'm about to reveal to you isn't just another conspiracy theory cooked up in someone's basement. This is the culmination of decades of research, leaked documents, and testimonies from insiders who risked everything to expose what they discovered. We're talking about evidence that traces an unbroken chain of influence stretching from the pharaohs of ancient Egypt to the power brokers of Wall Street. Now, I know what you're thinking. Another secret society documentary, right? Wrong. What makes this different is that we're not just going to talk about theories and speculation. We're going to follow the money, decode the symbols, and trace the bloodlines. We're going to examine archaeological evidence that mainstream historians refuse to acknowledge, financial records that were never meant to see daylight, and ritual practices that have been hidden in plain sight for centuries. Here's what's going to blow your mind. This organization has been so successful at hiding in the shadows that most people have never even heard their real name. The groups you think you know about, the ones that get mentioned in Hollywood movies and sensationalized documentaries, they're just the public face, the distraction. The real power lies with an inner circle so secretive that their meetings don't appear on any calendar, their membership lists don't exist in any database, and their true agenda has never been spoken aloud outside of their sacred chambers. But tonight, we're going to change that. We're going to pull back the curtain and expose the machinery that has been grinding away behind world events for millennia. And fair warning, once you see what I'm about to show you, you can't unsee it. Every news story, every political election, every economic crisis will look different through the lens of what you're about to learn. Let me paint you a picture that's going to fundamentally shift how you view reality. Imagine you're watching a chess game between two grandmasters. You see the pieces moving, you witness the strategies unfolding, you celebrate the victories and mourn the defeats. But what if I told you that both players were actually being coached by the same hidden advisor? What if the entire game was choreographed, and the real purpose wasn't to determine a winner, but to distract you from noticing that your wallet was being picked while you watched? That's exactly what's been happening to human civilization for over 3,000 years. The wars, the revolutions, the rise and fall of nations, they're all moves on a chessboard controlled by players you've never seen. And the most terrifying part? They're not even trying to hide it anymore. The symbols are everywhere, the rituals are performed in public, and the evidence is scattered across every major historical event. They've become so confident in their control that they're practically flaunting their power in front of us. Think about it. Why do the most powerful people in the world gather at secretive meetings in remote locations? Why do they perform strange ceremonies involving ancient symbols and archaic languages? Why do they swear blood oaths to organizations that supposedly don't exist? And why, when asked about these activities, do they either deny everything or claim it's just harmless tradition? The answer is simpler and more disturbing than you might imagine. These aren't just old boys clubs or networking events. These are the continuation of religious and political practices that trace their origins to the mystery schools of ancient Egypt, the secret rites of Babylon, and the hidden wisdom of civilizations that were already ancient when Rome was just a collection of mud huts. But here's where it gets really interesting. This isn't just about power for power's sake. This organization has a specific goal, a grand design that they've been working toward for millennia. Every major historical event, every shift in global power, every technological advancement has been carefully orchestrated to bring us closer to their ultimate objective. And we're living through the final stages of their plan right now. I know this sounds impossible. I know your rational mind is screaming that no organization could maintain this level of secrecy and influence for thousands of years, but that's exactly what they're counting on. They've conditioned us to dismiss these ideas as fantasy, to laugh off the very notion that such coordination could exist. Meanwhile, they've been operating in plain sight, using our skepticism as their greatest shield. Consider this. How many times have you heard someone dismiss a legitimate concern by calling it a conspiracy theory? How often have you seen important questions shut down with ridicule rather than investigation? That's not an accident. That's a psychological weapon that's been deployed against anyone who gets too close to the truth. They've weaponized our own intelligence against us, making us feel foolish for asking the questions that matter most. But tonight we're going to ask those questions anyway. We're going to follow the evidence wherever it leads, no matter how uncomfortable the destination. We're going to examine documents that were never meant to be public, decode symbols that have hidden in plain sight for centuries, and trace connections that span continents and centuries. And here's what's going to make your blood run cold. The deeper we dig, the more we discover that this isn't ancient history. This organization isn't some relic from the past that's lost its relevance. They're more active today than they've ever been, and their influence over global events has never been stronger. The technology that connects our world, the financial systems that control our economy, the political structures that govern our societies, they all bear the fingerprints of this ancient brotherhood. Every major corporation, every influential government, every powerful institution has been infiltrated by members of this organization. They don't need to control everyone. They just need to control the key positions, the decision makers, the people who shape policy and influence public opinion, and they've been remarkably successful at placing their people exactly where they need them. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this entire revelation is how they've managed to hide their activities in the most obvious places. The symbols of their organization appear on government buildings, corporate logos, and religious institutions around the world. Their sacred numbers and geometric patterns are embedded in the architecture of major cities. Their ritual dates align with national holidays and important political events. They're not hiding. They're celebrating their success right in front of us. This is the story they never wanted you to hear. The truth they've spent centuries and fortunes to suppress. It's the missing piece of the puzzle that explains why our world works the way it does, why certain patterns repeat throughout history, and why the same families and institutions seem to maintain power regardless of what political or economic changes occur around them. So buckle up, because we're about to embark on a journey that will take us from the sand-covered temples of ancient Egypt to the gleaming skyscrapers of modern financial districts. We'll decode messages carved in stone thousands of years ago and discover they're still being transmitted through modern media. We'll trace bloodlines that connect ancient pharaohs to contemporary power brokers and uncover rituals that have been performed continuously for over 30 centuries. This isn't just history. This is the blueprint for understanding how our world really operates. And once you see the pattern, once you recognize the symbols and understand the connections, you'll never look at current events the same way again. Every news story will reveal hidden layers of meaning, every political development will fit into a larger tapestry of control, and every major decision by world leaders will make perfect sense when viewed through the lens of this ancient agenda. The rabbit hole goes deeper than you ever imagined, and we're just getting started. Now let me show you something that's going to make everything click into place. Picture yourself walking through any major city, New York, London, Washington, D.C., and really looking at the buildings around you. Not just glancing, but truly observing the architectural details, the sculptures, the symbols carved into stone facades. What you'll discover is that the same mysterious iconography appears over and over again, in places where it has no logical reason to exist. Why does an ancient Egyptian obelisk stand in the heart of London? Why do government buildings around the world feature the same geometric patterns that adorn temples dedicated to forgotten gods? Why do corporate headquarters display symbols that would have been instantly recognizable to priests in ancient Babylon? The answer isn't coincidence, it's communication. These symbols are a language, and once you learn to read it, you'll realize that our entire world is covered in their messages. But here's what's going to shake you to your core. This symbolic language isn't just decorative, it's functional. These aren't random artistic choices made by architects who happen to like ancient Egyptian motifs. Every placement is deliberate, every symbol serves a purpose, and every building that displays these markers is announcing its allegiance to something far older and more powerful than any modern government or corporation. Think about the last time you handled paper money. Did you ever wonder why the imagery on currency is so specific, so consistent across different nations? Why do bills from countries that have never had diplomatic relations still feature remarkably similar symbolic elements? Why do the numbers, dates, and measurements on these bills align with astronomical events and ancient calendar systems? Because money isn't just a medium of exchange, it's a ritual object, and every transaction you make is participating in a ceremony you never consented to join. This is where most people's minds start to rebel against what they're hearing. The idea that every dollar spent, every purchase made, every financial transaction conducted is actually part of an elaborate ritual system seems too fantastical to believe. But consider this. Money only has value because we collectively agree it has value. That agreement isn't random. It's manufactured, maintained, and manipulated by the same forces that have been controlling human societies for millennia. The banking system that governs our entire global economy operates on principles and practices that trace directly back to the temple complexes of ancient civilizations. The same families that controlled the money supply in medieval Europe are still controlling it today, using institutions and mechanisms that have been refined over centuries but never fundamentally changed. They've just gotten better at hiding their involvement behind layers of corporate structure and legal complexity. Now let me take you deeper into this labyrinth. Every major historical event that shaped our modern world, the rise and fall of empires, the timing of wars, the emergence of new technologies, the spread of religions, all of these followed patterns that become obvious once you know what to look for. It's not that history repeats itself randomly, it's that the same orchestrating force has been guiding events according to a timeline that was established thousands of years ago. Consider the French Revolution, which most people view as a spontaneous uprising of oppressed people against their aristocratic rulers. But when you examine the timing, the financing, the key players, and the aftermath, a very different picture emerges. The revolution wasn't organic, it was manufactured. The same hidden networks that funded both sides of the conflict also positioned themselves to benefit from the chaos that followed. They removed one power structure only to replace it with another that served their purposes even better. This pattern repeats throughout history with clockwork precision. World War I wasn't just a tragic accident triggered by an assassination. The financing, the alliances, the timing, and even the geographic boundaries of the conflict all served specific purposes that had nothing to do with the official reasons given for the war. The same families and institutions that profited from the conflict also helped determine when it would begin and when it would end. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. These weren't separate events manipulated by opportunistic groups. They were phases of a single, continuous plan that has been unfolding for centuries. Each war, each revolution, each economic collapse has moved human civilization closer to a specific goal that was outlined in texts written before most of our modern nations even existed. And the most unsettling part? We're living through the culmination of this plan right now. Every major trend shaping our contemporary world, the centralization of power, the erosion of national sovereignty, the push toward global governance, the increasing surveillance of populations, the manipulation of information, all of these developments were predicted and planned for in documents that are hundreds of years old. The technology that we think of as revolutionary and unprecedented is actually the fulfillment of goals that were established long before computers, internet, or digital communication were even imagined. The tools have changed, but the objectives remain exactly the same as they were when this organization first began implementing their strategy in the ancient world. Let me show you how this works in practice. Think about social media and how it's transformed human interaction over the past 2 decades. Most people see this as an organic development driven by technological innovation and market forces. But when you examine who funded the research, who provided the initial investment, who guided the development of these platforms, and who benefits from the data they collect, you discover the same networks of influence that have been shaping human society for millennia. These platforms weren't created to connect people or democratize information. They were designed to monitor behavior, influence thinking, and harvest psychological data on a scale that would have been impossible with previous technology. Every like, every share, every comment is being analyzed not just for marketing purposes, but for social control. The same families that once used town criers and printed pamphlets to shape public opinion are now using algorithms and artificial intelligence to achieve the same goals with unprecedented precision. But the truly masterful aspect of their strategy is how they've convinced us that we chose this. We signed up for these services voluntarily. We agreed to their terms of service. We handed over our personal information willingly. They didn't need to force compliance, they just had to make surveillance feel like convenience and control feel like connection. This is the genius of their approach. They don't rule through obvious tyranny or visible oppression. They rule through manufactured consent, creating systems that feel like freedom while functioning as invisible prisons. They've perfected the art of making their victims grateful for their chains. And nowhere is this more evident than in how they've shaped our understanding of history itself. The version of events taught in schools, promoted in documentaries, and accepted as fact by most people isn't just incomplete, it's deliberately misleading. Not through outright lies, but through careful omission, selective emphasis, and strategic framing that obscures the true patterns of power and influence. The heroes and villains of our historical narratives were chosen not based on their actual impact, but on whether their stories serve the purposes of this hidden organization. The dates we commemorate, the events we remember, the lessons we're taught to draw from the past, all of these have been carefully curated to maintain a worldview that serves their interests. Real history, the history of who actually controlled events, who made the key decisions, who profited from conflicts, and who shaped the trajectory of human development, has been systematically erased from public consciousness. Not destroyed, just hidden behind layers of academic complexity and institutional access that ensure only approved researchers ever get close to the truth. This is why breakthrough discoveries about ancient civilizations are often suppressed or ignored. This is why archaeological evidence that challenges established timelines mysteriously disappears or gets locked away in private collections. This is why researchers who get too close to certain truths suddenly lose their funding, their institutional support, or their credibility. The official story of human development, that we evolved from primitive hunter-gatherers to sophisticated civilizations through gradual technological and social progress, serves their narrative perfectly. It suggests that our current systems of government, finance, and social organization represent the pinnacle of human achievement, making any questioning of these systems seem backward or regressive. But the evidence tells a very different story. Archaeological discoveries, ancient texts, and genetic research all point to the existence of advanced civilizations that possessed knowledge and capabilities that we're only beginning to understand today. These weren't primitive societies that got lucky with a few impressive achievements. They were sophisticated cultures with access to information and technologies that have been deliberately obscured from modern understanding. And here's the connection that's going to rearrange everything you thought you knew. This ancient knowledge didn't disappear. It was preserved, protected, and passed down through the very organization we're investigating. While the general population was kept in ignorance, this secret society maintained libraries, laboratories, and training centers where the real wisdom of human civilization was studied and advanced. They didn't just inherit power from previous generations, they inherited knowledge. Knowledge about human psychology, about natural forces, about technologies and techniques that give them capabilities that seem almost supernatural to those who don't possess the same information. This isn't magic or mysticism, it's applied science based on understanding that has been accumulated and refined over thousands of years. The rituals they perform, the symbols they use, the dates they choose for important events, none of this is arbitrary or traditional. It's all based on precise understanding of forces and principles that modern science is only beginning to rediscover. They're not primitive people clinging to ancient superstitions. They're advanced practitioners using knowledge that makes our current scientific understanding look elementary. And that knowledge is being applied right now in ways that affect every aspect of your daily life. The timing of economic announcements, the scheduling of political events, the release of new technologies, the emergence of social movements, All of these follow patterns and principles that trace back to the wisdom traditions maintained by this secret society. This is how they've maintained control for so long. It's not just about having money or political connections. It's about understanding how human systems actually work at the deepest level and using that understanding to guide events in directions that serve their ultimate objectives. They're not just reacting to circumstances. They're creating the circumstances that everyone else reacts to. We're not just dealing with a conspiracy. We're dealing with a science of control that has been perfected over millennia and is now being deployed with technologies and reach that the original practitioners could never have imagined. And the most frightening part is that we're approaching the endgame of their strategy, the culmination of thousands of years of careful planning and preparation. But to truly understand the magnitude of what we're facing, we need to go back to where it all began. We need to trace this organization to its roots, to the moment when a small group of individuals made a decision that would echo through every century that followed. And that moment didn't happen in some medieval castle or Renaissance palace. It happened in the shadow of the Great Pyramid, in chambers that were already ancient when Moses was still a prince of Egypt. The year was approximately 1350 BCE, and the political landscape of the ancient world was shifting in ways that few people understood at the time. The Egyptian Empire was at the height of its power, but cracks were beginning to show. The traditional priesthood that had maintained order for centuries was being challenged by new ideas, new technologies, and new approaches to understanding the divine forces that governed human affairs. It was during this period of upheaval that a group of high-ranking priests, court officials, and military commanders came together to form what they called the Sacred Brotherhood of the Eternal Flame. But this wasn't just another religious sect or political alliance. These were individuals who had access to the most closely guarded secrets of Egyptian civilization, the knowledge that built the pyramids, the wisdom that aligned the temples with celestial events, the techniques that allowed pharaohs to maintain absolute control over millions of subjects. What made this group different from the countless other secret societies that have emerged throughout history was their understanding of something that most people still don't grasp today: the science of civilizational control. They had figured out that human societies operate according to predictable patterns, that these patterns could be influenced through specific interventions, and that whoever controlled these interventions could effectively steer the development of entire cultures across multiple generations. Think about what this means. While everyone else was focused on immediate political gains or short-term advantages, this group was thinking in terms of centuries and millennia. They weren't trying to control the next election or the next war. They were designing systems that would allow them to control the trajectory of human development itself. The evidence for this is scattered across archaeological sites throughout Egypt, but it's been deliberately misinterpreted by mainstream historians who either don't recognize what they're looking at or have been discouraged from pursuing certain lines of investigation. The hieroglyphic texts that describe the formation of this brotherhood were mistranslated as religious mythology. The architectural evidence of their meeting places was dismissed as ceremonial decoration. The mathematical principles embedded in their sacred geometry were ignored as primitive superstition. But when you know what to look for, when you understand the symbolic language they use to communicate, the truth becomes undeniable. These weren't primitive mystics performing meaningless rituals. These were sophisticated strategists implementing a comprehensive plan for long-term social engineering on a scale that wouldn't be attempted again until the modern era. The key insight that drove their entire strategy was the recognition that human societies are fundamentally cyclical. Civilizations rise, reach a peak, decline, and collapse according to patterns that can be predicted and influenced. But instead of trying to prevent these cycles or ride them passively, this brotherhood developed techniques for managing the transitions between cycles in ways that preserved their power and advanced their agenda regardless of which civilization was currently dominant. This is why they've survived the fall of Egypt, the collapse of Rome, the decline of the Byzantine Empire, the fragmentation of medieval Europe, and every other major historical transition that destroyed their contemporaries. They didn't tie their fortunes to any single political system or cultural framework. Instead, they created meta-systems that could adapt to any environment while maintaining their core objectives. The Sacred Brotherhood of the Eternal Flame, which would eventually evolve into the organization we're investigating today, established 3 fundamental principles that have guided their operations for over 3,000 years. First, control the flow of information to shape public perception of reality. Second, manage the cycles of economic expansion and contraction to concentrate wealth during periods of chaos. Third, maintain influence over the selection and training of leadership across all major institutions. These principles might sound simple, but their implementation required developing capabilities that were centuries ahead of their time. They created the first systematic approaches to mass psychology, the first sophisticated methods for financial manipulation, and the first comprehensive strategies for institutional infiltration. They were conducting social science experiments on entire populations when most people still believed that weather was controlled by angry gods. The documentation of their early activities is hidden in plain sight throughout Egyptian temples and tombs, but it's encoded in symbolic language that requires specialized knowledge to interpret. The same symbols that appear in the burial chamber of Pharaoh Amenhotep III can be found carved into medieval cathedrals, painted into Renaissance artwork, and incorporated into the architecture of modern government buildings. This isn't coincidence or cultural borrowing, it's an unbroken chain of communication spanning millennia. But the most remarkable aspect of their strategy was how they planned for their own succession across multiple generations. They didn't just recruit members, they bred them. They didn't just pass down wealth, they passed down knowledge, techniques, and objectives that could be maintained regardless of changing circumstances. They created what essentially amounts to a genetic and intellectual dynasty that has persisted through every major historical upheaval. The bloodlines that controlled ancient Egypt are still controlling global finance today. The families that advised Roman emperors are still advising world leaders. The same genetic markers that appear in the DNA of Egyptian high priests show up in the genealogies of modern banking dynasties. This isn't speculation, it's documented fact that's been verified through genetic research that most people will never see because it's buried in classified databases. This is how they've maintained consistency of purpose across such vast spans of time. Each generation isn't starting fresh or making up new objectives as they go along. They're implementing phases of a plan that was designed by their ancestors and will be continued by their descendants. They think in terms of bloodlines and centuries while everyone else thinks in terms of careers and decades. The implications of this are staggering when you really consider what it means. Every major historical event that shaped our world was influenced by people who knew exactly how it fit into a larger pattern that most participants couldn't see. The rise of Christianity, the fall of Rome, the Crusades, the Renaissance, the Age of Exploration, the Industrial Revolution, the World Wars, all of these were phases in a single continuous plan that has been unfolding for 3,000 years. And we're not just talking about opportunistic groups that took advantage of historical trends, we're talking about the forces that created those trends in the first place. They didn't just profit from the chaos of the Dark Ages, they engineered the collapse of Roman infrastructure to create the conditions that made feudalism inevitable. They didn't just benefit from the Age of Exploration, they funded the expeditions and controlled the trade routes that emerged from those discoveries. This is the level of long-term thinking that separates them from every other power structure in human history. While kings and emperors were focused on expanding their territories or defeating their immediate enemies, this brotherhood was laying the groundwork for changes that wouldn't become visible for centuries. They were playing a game that most people didn't even know existed. The transition from the ancient world to the medieval period provides a perfect example of how their system works in practice. When it became clear that the Roman Empire was becoming unsustainable, they didn't try to save it or reform it. Instead, they began positioning themselves to control whatever emerged from its collapse. They infiltrated the early Christian church, established relationships with barbarian leaders, and created financial networks that could operate independently of imperial authority. By the time Rome actually fell, they had already built alternative power structures that allowed them to maintain influence, regardless of which group ended up controlling the political apparatus. The collapse that devastated everyone else actually strengthened their position because they were the only organization that had prepared for it and positioned themselves to benefit from it. This pattern has repeated itself throughout history with remarkable consistency. Every time a major civilization has reached the point of collapse, this same organization has somehow managed to not just survive the transition, but emerge from it with greater power and influence than they had before. They've perfected the art of turning chaos into opportunity and crisis into advancement. The medieval period saw them establish the foundations of modern banking through their control of the Knights Templar and other supposedly religious organizations. The Renaissance allowed them to fund artistic and scientific developments that advanced their understanding of human psychology and natural forces. The age of exploration gave them access to global resources and the ability to create worldwide networks of influence. Each historical period provided them with new tools and capabilities that they incorporated into their overall strategy. They weren't just preserving ancient knowledge, they were constantly updating and expanding it based on new discoveries and changing circumstances. They've maintained a continuous program of research and development that spans 3 millennia and encompasses every field of human knowledge. But perhaps the most ingenious aspect of their approach has been their ability to hide their activities behind legitimate institutions and movements. The same organization that controlled Egyptian priesthoods also influenced early Christianity. The group that managed medieval banking also guided the development of Renaissance art. The forces that shaped the Industrial Revolution also directed the emergence of modern democracy. They don't operate through a single visible organization that could be exposed or eliminated. Instead, they work through networks of affiliated groups, each of which appears to be independent and legitimate to outside observers. The connections between these groups are hidden behind layers of legal structure, financial complexity, and institutional bureaucracy that make them nearly impossible to trace without access to insider information. This is why most investigations into secret societies focus on groups like the Freemasons, the Illuminati, or the Bilderberg Group. These organizations are real, and they do have influence, but they're just the visible tip of an iceberg that extends much deeper than most people realize. The real power lies with the coordinating force that guides and connects all of these smaller groups according to an overarching strategy that none of them fully understand. Think of it like a massive corporation with multiple subsidiaries operating in different markets. Each subsidiary has its own management structure, its own objectives, and its own methods of operation, but they're all ultimately controlled by a parent company that sets the overall strategic direction and allocates resources according to priorities that the subsidiary managers may not be aware of. The difference is that this particular organization has been operating the same basic structure for over 3,000 years, constantly adapting its methods while maintaining consistent objectives. They've had centuries to perfect their techniques for compartmentalization, misdirection, and operational security. They've learned from every mistake, improved on every success, and refined their approach through dozens of generations of continuous operation. And now, in the 21st century, they're approaching the culmination of their longest-term objectives. The global systems of communication, finance, and governance that have emerged over the past few decades aren't random developments driven by technological progress and market forces. They're the fulfillment of plans that were laid out centuries ago by people who understood exactly where human civilization was heading and how to position themselves to control its destination. The internet that connects our world was designed according to principles that trace back to the communication networks used by ancient Egyptian priests. The financial systems that govern our economy operate on the same mathematical principles that were used to manage resources in pharaonic Egypt. The surveillance technologies that monitor our behavior implement psychological techniques that were developed in the mystery schools of the ancient world. We're not just living through a period of rapid change and technological development. We're living through the final phase of a plan that has been in development for 3,000 years. And the most disturbing part is that most of the people implementing this plan don't even realize they're doing it. They think they're just doing their jobs, following market forces, or responding to technological opportunities. They have no idea that their decisions are being guided by forces that have been preparing for this moment since before the pyramids were built. This is the true genius of their system. They don't need to control everyone, they just need to control the systems that everyone else operates within. They don't need to give orders to world leaders, they just need to create circumstances that make certain decisions inevitable. They don't need to force compliance, they just need to make resistance seem impractical or impossible. And they've reached a point where their control is so comprehensive, so deeply embedded in every aspect of modern life, that most people can't even imagine what alternative systems might look like. We've been so thoroughly conditioned to accept their framework as natural and inevitable, that questioning it feels like questioning reality itself. But that's exactly what we need to do. Because the endgame of their 3,000-year plan isn't just about maintaining power or accumulating wealth. It's about fundamentally transforming human civilization in ways that will affect every person on this planet for generations to come. And if we don't understand what's happening, if we don't see the pattern and recognize the trajectory we're on, we'll sleepwalk into a future that was designed by people whose priorities and values are completely alien to our own. The time for willful ignorance is over. The time for comfortable denial has passed. We're living through the most critical period in human history, and the decisions made in the next few years will determine whether our species maintains any meaningful degree of freedom and self-determination, or whether we become permanent subjects of a system that views us as nothing more than resources to be managed and harvested. The evidence I'm about to present will fundamentally alter your perception of every major institution you've ever trusted. Because what we're dealing with isn't just historical manipulation, it's active, ongoing orchestration of reality itself, and the breadcrumbs they've left behind form a trail so obvious, so blatant, that you'll wonder how you never noticed it before. Let me show you something that's going to make your skin crawl. Take out your phone right now and open any major news application. Scroll through the headlines, but this time don't read them for content. Instead, look at the timing of when stories break, the sequence in which they're released, and the mathematical patterns hidden in the publication schedules. What you'll discover is that major news events don't happen randomly. They follow a precise calendar that corresponds to astronomical events, historical anniversaries, and numerical sequences that would have been sacred to ancient Egyptian priests. This isn't coincidence. This is coordination on a scale that defies everything we've been taught about how information flows in the modern world. The same mathematical principles that determined when pharaohs would make public announcements are still being used to time everything from market crashes to political scandals to natural disaster reports. They're not just reporting the news, they're manufacturing it according to schedules that were established thousands of years ago. But here's where it gets truly sinister. The content of these news stories isn't random either. Every major narrative that dominates public discourse, from climate change to terrorism to economic inequality, serves specific psychological functions that advance their long-term objectives. They're not just trying to inform you or even deceive you. They're conducting mass psychological conditioning on a global scale, using techniques that trace back to the mind control methods developed in ancient Egyptian temples. Think about how news consumption has changed over the past decade. Stories that once would have been investigated thoroughly are now reduced to headlines that flash across your screen for seconds before being replaced by the next crisis. Your attention is being deliberately fragmented, your capacity for deep thinking systematically eroded, your emotional responses carefully calibrated through exposure to precisely crafted stimuli. This isn't the natural evolution of media in a digital age. This is the implementation of a behavioral modification program that was designed to create specific psychological states in targeted populations. Every notification you receive, every trending topic you see, every viral video that captures your attention has been strategically placed to influence your thoughts, emotions, and decisions in ways you're not consciously aware of. The algorithms that determine what content you see aren't neutral mathematical formulas responding to user preferences. They're psychological warfare tools that implement principles of mind control that were perfected in the mystery schools of the ancient world. The same techniques that Egyptian priests used to maintain absolute authority over their subjects are now being deployed through social media platforms, search engines, and streaming services that reach billions of people simultaneously. But the manipulation goes far deeper than just information control. They've weaponized our most basic human needs and desires against us. The craving for connection that drives social media usage, the pursuit of convenience that makes us dependent on digital services, the desire for security that leads us to accept surveillance. All of these natural human impulses have been exploited to create systems of control that are more comprehensive than anything ever achieved by traditional authoritarian regimes. Consider how much of your daily life now depends on systems that you don't control and don't understand. Your money exists as digital entries in databases managed by institutions that operate according to rules you've never seen. Your communications flow through networks owned by corporations whose decision-making processes are completely opaque to you. Your access to information is mediated by algorithms that prioritize content based on criteria that are never disclosed. You're not living in a free society that happens to use convenient technologies. You're living in a technological prison that's designed to feel like freedom while functioning as the most sophisticated control system ever devised. And the most terrifying part is that you helped build it by voluntarily providing the data, the behavioral patterns, and the psychological profiles that make this level of control possible. Every search you perform, every purchase you make, every location you visit, every person you communicate with is being recorded, analyzed, and integrated into a comprehensive model of your personality, preferences, and vulnerabilities. This information isn't just being used for marketing or even surveillance, it's being used to predict and influence your future behavior with accuracy that would seem magical to people from previous generations. They know what you're going to buy before you decide to buy it. They know who you're going to vote for before you make up your mind. They know what you're going to think about political issues before those issues even become public. They've created a system that doesn't just respond to human behavior. It shapes it, guides it, and ultimately controls it at a level that makes traditional propaganda look primitive by comparison. But this technological control system isn't separate from the ancient organization we've been investigating. It's the latest evolution of the same power structure that's been manipulating human societies for 3,000 years. The families that controlled information flow in ancient Egypt are the same families that control information flow today. They've just upgraded their tools while maintaining their fundamental objectives. The transition from physical control to psychological control to technological control represents the culmination of centuries of strategic planning. Each phase prepared the ground for the next, creating populations that would willingly adopt systems that previous generations would have recognized as slavery. They've made us grateful for our chains by convincing us that they're actually conveniences. And nowhere is this more evident than in the financial system that governs every aspect of modern life. The money in your bank account isn't real in any meaningful sense. It's just numbers in a computer database that can be altered or deleted at will by people you'll never meet. The value of that money isn't determined by market forces or economic fundamentals. It's manipulated through mechanisms that operate according to the same principles that were used to control grain distribution in ancient Egypt. The Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, and every other major financial institution in the world are all branches of the same system that traces its origins back to the temple complexes where Egyptian priests managed the resources of entire civilizations. The same families that controlled the flow of gold and grain in the ancient world are still controlling the flow of credit and currency today. But they've made the system so complex, so abstract, so removed from physical reality that most people can't even comprehend how it works, let alone challenge it. You can't fight an enemy you can't see, and you can't escape a prison you don't realize you're in. They've achieved the perfect form of control, one that's invisible to its victims and feels voluntary to those who participate in it. The cryptocurrency revolution that many people see as a challenge to traditional banking is actually the next phase of their plan. Digital currencies aren't being developed to free us from centralized control. They're being created to make that control more absolute than ever before. When all money exists only as digital entries in centralized databases, when every transaction is recorded and monitored, when access to the medium of exchange can be revoked instantly for any reason, the power to control human behavior becomes total. This isn't speculation about what might happen in the future. The infrastructure for this system is being built right now, and it's being implemented through the same gradual, incremental process that has characterized all of their major initiatives. They don't impose dramatic changes that would trigger resistance. Instead, they create crises that make their solutions seem necessary and inevitable. The economic disruptions of recent years, the supply chain problems, the inflation, the banking instabilities, none of these are random market events. They're manufactured crises designed to make populations desperate enough to accept solutions that they would have rejected under normal circumstances. Each crisis moves us one step closer to complete dependence on systems that they control absolutely. And the most insidious part is how they've convinced us that we're making progress, that we're advancing toward a better future through technological innovation and social reform. The same people who created the problems are presenting themselves as the solution. The same institutions that have been manipulating us for centuries are positioning themselves as our protectors and guides. The environmental movement, the push for social justice, the campaign for global governance, all of these apparently grassroots initiatives are actually top-down programs designed to justify the concentration of power in the hands of unelected international institutions. They're not trying to save the planet or protect human rights. They're using our genuine concerns about these issues to manipulate us into accepting systems of control that would have been impossible to implement through direct force. This is psychological warfare at its most sophisticated level. They've turned our own values against us, made us complicit in our own subjugation by convincing us that resistance to their agenda is morally wrong. They've made questioning their narrative feel like selfishness, made independence seem like antisocial behavior, made critical thinking appear to be a form of dangerous extremism. The same organization that once maintained control through religious authority and royal decree now maintains control through scientific consensus and moral righteousness. They've adapted their methods to exploit the psychological vulnerabilities of each era while maintaining the same fundamental objective, the complete subordination of human will to their institutional authority. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of their current operation is how they've begun to dispense with the illusion of consent entirely. The lockdowns, the mandates, the censorship, the surveillance, these aren't temporary emergency measures that will be rolled back when crises pass. They're permanent changes to the social contract that reveal how much power they've accumulated and how little they now care about maintaining the pretense of democratic governance. They've reached a point where they no longer need to hide their activities or disguise their intentions. The infrastructure of control is so complete, so deeply embedded in every aspect of modern life, that open resistance has become practically impossible for most people. They can afford to be more direct about their objectives because they've made the alternatives to compliance seem worse than submission. This is the endgame of their 3,000-year strategy. Not just the accumulation of wealth or the concentration of political power, but the fundamental transformation of human consciousness itself. They're not just trying to control what you do, they're trying to control what you think, what you feel, what you believe is possible. The ultimate goal isn't to rule over free people who happen to be temporarily compliant. The ultimate goal is to create a species that has forgotten what freedom feels like, that can't even imagine alternatives to the systems they've created. They want to make resistance literally unthinkable by eliminating the psychological and intellectual foundations that make resistance possible. And they're remarkably close to achieving this objective. Look around you at how people respond to information that challenges official narratives. Look at how quickly dissenting voices are marginalized or silenced. Look at how effectively they've made curiosity seem dangerous and conformity seem virtuous. The same techniques that Egyptian priests used to maintain religious orthodoxy are now being deployed through educational institutions, media organizations, and social platforms to maintain scientific and political orthodoxy. The methods have evolved, but the underlying principles remain exactly the same. Question the approved narrative and you'll be treated as a heretic regardless of the evidence you present. This is how they've maintained power across such vast spans of time and such dramatic changes in technology and culture. They don't just control institutions, they control the frameworks of thought that make certain ideas acceptable and others unthinkable. They don't just influence what people believe, they determine what people are capable of believing. But here's what they didn't count on. And here's why this moment in history represents both the greatest danger and the greatest opportunity humanity has ever faced. The same technologies they've used to create unprecedented systems of control have also created unprecedented opportunities for awakening. The internet that monitors your behavior also allows you to access information that was previously available only to insiders. The digital networks that spread their propaganda also enable truth-tellers to reach audiences that traditional gatekeepers would never have allowed them to address. For the first time in 3,000 years, their monopoly on information is breaking down. The same systems they created to control us are being used against them by people who understand how those systems work and aren't afraid to expose the truth. The decentralized nature of digital communication makes it impossible for them to completely suppress information the way they could when all media flowed through centralized channels they controlled. This is why we're seeing such desperate attempts to censor, deplatform, and discredit anyone who questions their narrative. This is why they're pushing so hard to implement new forms of control before their current systems collapse entirely. They know their window of opportunity is closing, and they're racing to lock in their advantages before too many people wake up to what's actually happening. But the awakening is accelerating faster than they anticipated. More people are asking the right questions, making the right connections, and refusing to accept the official explanations for events that obviously don't make sense. The psychological conditioning that worked so effectively on previous generations is losing its power over populations that have access to alternative sources of information and analysis. This is the real battle being fought right now, not between different political parties or ideological factions, but between those who want to maintain the illusion of normalcy and those who are willing to confront the reality of how our world actually operates. It's a battle between comfortable lies and uncomfortable truths, between the safety of conformity and the responsibility of awareness. And the outcome of this battle will determine whether the next phase of human development unfolds according to their ancient plan or according to possibilities they never anticipated and can't control. We're living through the most consequential moment in recorded history, and most people don't even realize it's happening. The question isn't whether you believe what I'm telling you. The question is whether you're willing to look at the evidence with an open mind and draw your own conclusions. The question is whether you have the courage to follow the trail of breadcrumbs they've left behind and see where it leads. The question is whether you're ready to take responsibility for understanding the world you actually live in, rather than the world you've been told you live in. Because once you see the pattern, once you recognize the symbols, once you understand the connections, there's no going back to comfortable ignorance. Once you realize that everything you thought you knew about history, politics, economics, and social organization is based on carefully constructed deceptions, you have to decide what you're going to do with that knowledge. You can deny it, dismiss it, rationalize it away, and try to return to the comfort of believing that someone else is looking out for your interests. Or you can accept it, integrate it, and begin the difficult work of figuring out how to live with integrity in a world that's been designed to make integrity impossible. That choice between comfortable delusion and difficult truth is the most important decision you'll ever make, because it determines not just how you understand the past and present, but how you prepare for a future that's going to be very different from anything most people are expecting. The storm is coming, and it's been building for 3,000 years. The only question is whether you'll be ready for it when it arrives, or whether you'll be swept away like everyone else who refused to see it coming until it was too late. But before we dive into what that future looks like, before we examine their final objectives and the timeline they're working toward, we need to understand exactly how they've managed to maintain such comprehensive control for so long without most people ever noticing. We need to decode the actual mechanisms they use to influence events, the specific techniques they employ to manipulate public opinion, and the organizational structures that allow them to coordinate activities across multiple generations and geographic regions. Because the more you understand about how their system actually works, the better equipped you'll be to recognize when it's being deployed against you, and the more effectively you'll be able to protect yourself and the people you care about from its influence. The knowledge I'm about to share with you isn't just academic information about historical events. It's practical intelligence that could save your life and preserve your freedom in the challenging years ahead. So pay attention, because what comes next is going to change everything you thought you knew about power, influence, and the hidden forces that shape human destiny. The rabbit hole goes deeper than you ever imagined, and we're about to descend to levels that most people never even suspect exist. Their organizational structure is unlike anything that has ever existed in recorded history. While other secret societies operate through lodges, chapters, or cells that can be infiltrated or exposed, this ancient brotherhood functions through what they call the concentric circle system. Picture a series of nested rings, each containing people who believe they understand the full scope of the organization, but who are actually only seeing the layer that surrounds them. At the outermost ring, you have thousands of individuals who participate in what appear to be legitimate professional associations, charitable foundations, and cultural institutions. These people genuinely believe they're working for humanitarian causes or advancing their careers through networking. They have no idea that their organizations are being guided by directives that originate from sources they've never heard of and will never meet. Move one ring inward, and you encounter the coordinators, people who manage multiple outer ring organizations, and begin to notice patterns in the instructions they receive. These individuals might suspect that there's a higher level of coordination happening, but they're told it's just efficient management or strategic planning. They're given enough additional information to feel privileged and important, but not enough to understand what they're actually facilitating. The next ring contains what they call the illuminated ones, individuals who know they're part of something larger and more significant than what they present to the outside world. These are your high-level politicians, corporate executives, media moguls, and academic leaders who coordinate policies across different sectors and nations. They understand that they're implementing a long-term agenda, but they believe it's for the betterment of humanity and the prevention of chaos. But here's where it gets truly sinister. Even these supposedly enlightened leaders are still operating within a framework of deception. They're told they're part of the inner circle, that they understand the full scope of the plan, that their actions are guided by wisdom and benevolence. They have no idea that they're just another layer of useful idiots being manipulated by forces they can't perceive. The true inner circle consists of perhaps a few dozen individuals worldwide who understand the actual objectives, the real timeline, and the ultimate destination of this 3,000-year journey. These are people whose names you've never heard, whose faces never appear in photographs, whose existence isn't documented in any public records. They communicate through methods that leave no traces, meet in locations that don't officially exist, and make decisions that affect billions of lives without anyone outside their circle ever knowing those decisions were made. What makes this system so effective is that each ring genuinely believes it's serving righteous purposes. The outer rings see themselves as philanthropists, professionals, and public servants. The middle rings see themselves as enlightened leaders working to create a better world. Even most of the inner rings believe they're protecting humanity from forces that would destroy civilization if left unchecked. This isn't just compartmentalization for security purposes, it's psychological conditioning that makes betrayal or whistleblowing virtually impossible. How can you expose something when you don't understand what you're actually part of? How can you rebel against a system when you believe that system represents the highest ideals of human civilization? The recruitment process for this organization is equally sophisticated. They don't seek out members. They create circumstances that cause the right people to seek them out. Through their control of educational institutions, media narratives, and cultural movements, they shape the development of individuals who will naturally gravitate toward the roles they need filled. Think about how many successful people describe their careers as a series of fortunate coincidences, unexpected opportunities, and helpful mentors who appeared at just the right moments. What they're actually describing is a carefully orchestrated process of identification, cultivation, and placement that's been refined over centuries. The individuals who rise to positions of influence in politics, business, academia, and media aren't there because they were the most qualified or worked the hardest. They're there because they demonstrated the psychological profile, intellectual capabilities, and moral flexibility required for the roles they've been assigned in the larger plan. But the most insidious aspect of their recruitment strategy is how they make their targets complicit in their own corruption. Nobody's approached directly and asked to join a secret society bent on world domination. Instead, they're presented with opportunities that require small compromises, minor ethical violations, or seemingly harmless deceptions. A young politician might be offered campaign funding in exchange for supporting a bill that seems beneficial but contains hidden provisions. A promising academic might be given research grants that steer their investigations toward conclusions that serve the organization's interests. A talented journalist might be provided with exclusive access to stories that shape public opinion in specific directions. Each step seems reasonable, even beneficial when considered in isolation. But over time, these small compromises create a web of obligation and complicity that makes it impossible for the individual to extract themselves, even if they begin to understand what they've become part of. They're not just employees or members, they're co-conspirators who have participated in their own recruitment and conditioning. The financial mechanisms they use to maintain control are equally sophisticated and virtually invisible to outside observation. While most people think about money in terms of currency, bank accounts, and market investments, this organization operates through systems that exist parallel to and largely independent of conventional financial institutions. They control what economists call the shadow banking system, a network of investment funds, trust companies, holding corporations, and offshore entities that manage resources worth trillions of dollars without appearing on any public balance sheets. These aren't illegal operations or criminal enterprises. They're perfectly legitimate business structures that operate according to laws and regulations that were written by the same people who control them. The genius of this approach is that it makes their financial power effectively unlimited while keeping it completely invisible. They don't need to steal money or manipulate markets in obvious ways. They control the systems that create money, the institutions that distribute it, and the rules that govern how it flows through the global economy. When they need to fund a particular operation, influence a specific election, or pressure a resistant government, they don't write checks from accounts labeled secret society operations. Instead, they adjust lending rates, modify investment policies, or restructure corporate relationships in ways that create the financial pressures needed to achieve their objectives. This is how they can simultaneously fund opposing political parties, competing corporations, and conflicting social movements without anyone noticing the common source behind apparently unrelated financial flows. The money that supports environmental activists and the money that funds industrial polluters both trace back to the same ultimate sources, flowing through different channels of the same financial network. But their control over information flow represents perhaps their most powerful tool for shaping human behavior and social development. While most people focus on obvious forms of media manipulation, biased news coverage, censored social media posts, suppressed scientific research, The real influence operation happens at a much deeper level. They don't just control what information you receive, they control the frameworks you use to interpret that information. They shape the categories you think with, the assumptions you make about how the world works, and the range of possibilities you consider when trying to understand events or make decisions. Consider how certain topics become controversial, while others are accepted without question. Consider how some ideas are treated as scientific fact, while others are dismissed as conspiracy theories, regardless of the evidence supporting them. Consider how particular solutions to social problems are always presented as the only reasonable options, while alternatives are never even mentioned in public discussions. This isn't the result of natural intellectual development or democratic deliberation. It's the product of carefully orchestrated information campaigns that operate through academic institutions, media organizations, think tanks, and cultural influencers who don't even realize they're implementing someone else's agenda. The same techniques that ancient Egyptian priests used to maintain religious orthodoxy are now deployed through scientific journals, news organizations, and educational curricula to maintain intellectual orthodoxy. The methods have evolved, but the underlying principles remain identical. Control the information environment, and you control the thoughts and behaviors of everyone operating within that environment. But perhaps their most sophisticated tool for social control is their mastery of what psychologists call manufactured consensus. This is the process of creating the illusion that everyone agrees about something, when that agreement has actually been artificially produced through coordinated manipulation of information and social pressure. Think about how quickly public opinion can shift on complex issues that most people don't have the time, expertise, or access to information necessary to evaluate independently. Think about how certain positions become socially unacceptable overnight, while others become mandatory expressions of virtue. Think about how people who expressed mainstream views yesterday suddenly find themselves marginalized as extremists today. This isn't organic social evolution. It's engineered opinion change implemented through networks of influence that most people don't even know exist. The same families that once used royal proclamations and religious edicts to shape public behavior now use polling data, social media algorithms, and celebrity endorsements to achieve identical results with greater efficiency and less resistance. They've perfected the art of making artificial consensus feel natural and inevitable. They make their manufactured opinions seem like the spontaneous expression of popular will. They make their imposed values appear to be the natural result of moral progress and social enlightenment. The speed at which these consensus manufacturing operations can be deployed has accelerated dramatically with digital technology. What once took years or decades to accomplish through traditional media and institutional influence can now be achieved in weeks or months through coordinated social media campaigns, algorithmic content manipulation, and targeted psychological operations. But the most terrifying aspect of their information control system is how they've learned to exploit the human need for certainty and belonging. In an increasingly complex and unstable world, people desperately want to believe that someone, somewhere, understands what's happening and has a plan for dealing with it. This psychological vulnerability makes populations extremely susceptible to narratives that promise simple explanations for complex problems and clear solutions for confusing situations. It doesn't matter if those explanations are accurate or those solutions are effective. What matters is that they provide the comfort of certainty and the security of group identity in an uncertain world. They've become masters at providing this false comfort while directing the resulting social energy toward objectives that serve their interest rather than the interests of the people who adopt their narratives. They don't need to convince everyone that their official stories are true. They just need to make alternative explanations seem more frightening or socially costly than accepting the approved version of events. This is why challenging their narratives feels so difficult and dangerous to most people. It's not just about being wrong about facts or making intellectual errors. It's about risking social isolation, professional consequences, and psychological discomfort that most people aren't prepared to handle. The same emotional and social pressures that once enforced religious conformity now enforce political and scientific conformity. The methods of enforcement have become more subtle and sophisticated, but the underlying mechanisms remain exactly the same. Make deviation from approved beliefs feel like moral failure and social suicide. However, their greatest strength may also be becoming their greatest vulnerability. The same centralized control systems that allow them to coordinate activities across vast distances and time spans also create single points of failure that could potentially bring down their entire operation if properly targeted. The technological networks they use to monitor and influence populations also create opportunities for their communications to be intercepted and their plans to be exposed. The financial systems they control are increasingly dependent on digital infrastructure that could be disrupted by people who understand how those systems actually work. Most importantly, their psychological control mechanisms become less effective as more people become aware of how they operate. Once you understand that your thoughts and emotions are being deliberately manipulated, once you recognize the techniques being used against you, those techniques lose much of their power to influence your behavior. This is why they're working so frantically to implement new forms of control before their current systems collapse entirely. They know that their window of opportunity is closing, that the awakening is accelerating faster than they anticipated, and that they may only have a few years left to lock in their advantages before resistance becomes impossible to contain. The next phase of their plan involves transitioning from psychological and financial control to direct technological control, systems that don't require your consent or cooperation to influence your behavior. Brain-computer interfaces that can monitor and modify thoughts directly. Digital currencies that can be programmed to restrict what you're allowed to purchase. Social credit systems that can limit your access to transportation, housing, and employment based on your compliance with approved behaviors. These aren't science fiction fantasies or distant future possibilities. The infrastructure for these systems is being built right now, tested in pilot programs, and gradually implemented through the same incremental process that has characterized all of their major initiatives. They're not waiting for public acceptance or democratic approval. They're creating circumstances that will make these systems seem necessary and inevitable. But they're also racing against time, because every day that passes brings more people to an understanding of what's actually happening. Every leaked document, every exposed connection, every failed prediction of their official narratives contributes to a growing awareness that their control is not as absolute as they want us to believe. The question isn't whether their system will eventually collapse. All systems of control eventually collapse when they become too rigid and overextended to adapt to changing circumstances. The question is whether that collapse will happen soon enough to prevent them from implementing the technological control systems that would make future resistance virtually impossible. And that timeline depends largely on how quickly people like you wake up to what's happening, how effectively you share that knowledge with others, and how courageously you act on that understanding despite the social and personal costs involved. The battle for the future of human consciousness is being fought right now in this moment. Through conversations like this one, every person who understands what's actually happening and refuses to be silent about it represents a crack in their system of control. Every individual who chooses difficult truth over comfortable lies makes their job just a little bit harder. They've spent 3,000 years perfecting their methods of control, but they've never faced a generation with access to the tools and information that you have right now. They've never had to maintain their deceptions in an environment where their communications can be intercepted, their meetings can be recorded, their financial transactions can be traced, and their propaganda can be analyzed and debunked in real time. For the first time in 3 millennia, the advantage is shifting away from the controllers and toward those who refuse to be controlled. But that advantage is temporary, and it will disappear completely if it's not used effectively while the opportunity still exists. The choice is yours, but the window for making that choice is closing rapidly. You can continue living in the comfortable illusion that someone else is looking out for your interests, that the systems governing your life are basically benevolent, and that the future will somehow work out for the best without your active involvement. Or you can accept the responsibility that comes with understanding how the world actually works, acknowledge the role you need to play in determining what happens next, and begin taking the actions necessary to protect yourself and preserve the possibility of freedom for future generations. But before you make that choice, before you decide whether you're ready to handle the truth about what's coming next, you need to understand exactly what their endgame looks like and how close we are to reaching it. You need to see the specific timeline they're working toward, the particular objectives they're trying to achieve, and the methods they plan to use for implementing the final phase of their 3,000-year strategy. Because once you understand what they're actually building, once you see how all the pieces fit together, once you recognize the true scope of what they're attempting to accomplish, you'll realize that everything we've discussed so far has just been the setup for something far more ambitious and terrifying than most people could ever imagine. The real revelation isn't what they've already done, it's what they're planning to do next. And that plan is so audacious, so comprehensive, so fundamentally transformative that it will either succeed completely or fail catastrophically. There's no middle ground, no partial implementation, no gradual rollback if things don't work out as expected. We're approaching the point of no return, the moment when their 3,000-year experiment either achieves its ultimate objective or collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. And which outcome we get depends entirely on whether enough people wake up in time to understand what's at stake and act accordingly. The evidence I'm about to present will leave no doubt about the reality of what we're facing, but it will also reveal opportunities and vulnerabilities that most people don't realize exist. The same forces that make their final push possible also create openings for resistance that have never existed before in human history. The question is whether you're ready to see the full scope of what's actually happening, and whether you have the courage to act on that knowledge even when doing so requires sacrificing the comfortable illusions that make normal life possible. Because once you cross this threshold, once you fully understand what they're building and how close they are to completing it, there's no going back to the innocence of not knowing. You'll carry this knowledge for the rest of your life, and it will affect every decision you make, every relationship you form, and every priority you set for yourself and your family. The choice to remain ignorant is still available to you, but it won't be available much longer. The events of the next few years will make the truth impossible to ignore, regardless of how desperately people want to avoid confronting it. So decide now, while you still have the luxury of choice, whether you want to face reality on your own terms or have it forced upon you by circumstances beyond your control. Because the storm that's been building for 3,000 years is about to break, and when it does, the only people who will survive it intact are those who saw it coming and prepared accordingly. The final phase of their plan is elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. After 3 millennia of gradual infiltration, careful manipulation, and patient positioning, they're ready to drop the pretense entirely and implement direct, overt control over every aspect of human existence. But to understand how they plan to accomplish this, and why they believe the timing is perfect for such an audacious move, we need to examine the convergence of technologies, social conditions, and psychological factors that have created what they see as a once-in-history opportunity to complete their ancient project. The pieces are all in place. The infrastructure has been built. The populations have been conditioned. The resistance has been neutralized. All that remains is the final activation of systems that have been decades in the making, disguised as responses to crises that were manufactured specifically to justify their implementation. And the most chilling part is that most people will welcome these changes, even demand them, because they've been psychologically conditioned to fear the chaos that will inevitably result from the collapse of the systems they are about to abandon. What they've created is what intelligence analysts call a controlled demolition scenario, the systematic dismantling of existing power structures in a way that channels the resulting chaos toward predetermined outcomes. Think about how a professional demolition expert brings down a skyscraper. They don't just plant explosives randomly and hope for the best. They carefully calculate where to place each charge, precisely time each detonation, and meticulously plan how the debris will fall to clear the space for whatever comes next. That's exactly what's happening to our civilization right now, except the building being demolished is the entire framework of national sovereignty, individual privacy, and economic independence that defined the modern world. And just like a controlled demolition, the collapse isn't accidental. It's engineered to create the exact conditions needed for the construction project that follows. The timeline they're operating on isn't driven by political cycles or market forces. It's synchronized with astronomical events that have guided their activities for millennia. The same celestial calendar that determined when pharaohs would make proclamations and when temple rituals would be performed is still being used to coordinate the implementation of policies that affect billions of people. This is why major announcements about digital currencies, climate policies, and global governance initiatives consistently align with specific dates that correspond to ancient Egyptian festival calendars. It's why international summits are scheduled to coincide with solstices, equinoxes, and other astronomical phenomena that would have been sacred to the mystery schools of the ancient world. They're not just following tradition or honouring their heritage. They're implementing a science of timing that recognizes how human consciousness fluctuates in response to cosmic cycles, and they're leveraging those fluctuations to maximize the psychological impact of their interventions. Consider how different you feel during different seasons, different phases of the moon, different times of day. These aren't random mood changes. They're responses to electromagnetic and gravitational forces that affect neural activity in predictable ways. Ancient priests understood these patterns and used them to time their most important ceremonies and announcements for maximum psychological effect. The same knowledge is being applied today through what they call psycho-atmospheric engineering, the deliberate coordination of policy announcements, media narratives, and social interventions with natural cycles that influence human receptivity to new ideas and behavioral changes. This is why lockdowns were implemented during specific moon phases. This is why economic announcements are timed to coincide with particular planetary alignments. This is why social movements seem to explode out of nowhere during certain times of the year, while similar efforts fail completely when launched during different periods. They've spent centuries mapping the relationship between cosmic cycles and human psychology, and they're using that knowledge to orchestrate social changes with the precision of a symphony conductor directing an orchestra. Every major transition we're experiencing right now has been timed according to principles that trace back to the astronomical observations of ancient Egyptian priests. But the celestial timing is just the framework. The actual mechanism of transformation relies on what psychologists call crisis solution conditioning, the deliberate creation of problems that can only be solved by accepting changes that people would normally resist. Think about how this pattern has played out repeatedly over the past few years. A crisis emerges that threatens something people value: their health, their security, their economic stability. The crisis generates fear, confusion, and desperation for solutions. Authorities present options that seem reasonable under the circumstances, but that would have been unthinkable during normal times. People accept these solutions gratefully, viewing them as temporary emergency measures, but somehow the emergency never quite ends, and the temporary measures become permanent features of the new normal. This isn't accidental crisis management or incompetent governance. It's psychological warfare designed to systematically erode resistance to changes that advance their long-term objectives. Each crisis conditions populations to accept a little more control, a little less privacy, a little more dependence on systems they don't understand and can't influence. The process is so gradual, so seemingly reasonable at each stage, that most people never notice how dramatically their lives have changed until it's too late to reverse course. Like the proverbial frog in slowly boiling water, populations adapt to each incremental change without recognizing that they're being cooked alive. But the individual crises aren't random or isolated events. They're coordinated elements of what military strategists call a full-spectrum operation. Simultaneous pressure applied across multiple domains to overwhelm the target's ability to respond effectively. While people are focused on managing one crisis, say a health emergency, other crises are being manufactured in different areas: economic disruption, social unrest, environmental disasters, technological failures, supply chain breakdowns, and information warfare campaigns all hit simultaneously, creating a state of perpetual emergency that makes rational analysis and coordinated resistance nearly impossible. This multi-domain approach ensures that even people who recognize the manipulation in one area remain vulnerable to influence in others. Someone who sees through the economic propaganda might still be susceptible to the health narratives. Someone who questions the environmental claims might still believe the security justifications. The psychological load of questioning everything simultaneously is more than most people can handle, so they pick their battles and accept official explanations in the areas where resistance feels too costly or complicated. The beauty of this strategy from their perspective is that it doesn't require controlling everyone's thinking about everything. It just requires preventing anyone from developing a comprehensive understanding of how all the different pressure points connect to serve a single overarching agenda. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of their current operation is how they've weaponized people's desire to be good, moral, contributing members of society. The same ethical impulses that once motivated resistance to tyranny are now being redirected to support the implementation of tyrannical systems. They've made compliance feel like compassion, submission feel like social responsibility, and resistance feel like selfishness. They've convinced people that questioning authority is equivalent to endangering others, that demanding evidence is a form of antisocial behavior, and that independent thinking is a luxury that responsible citizens can't afford during times of crisis. This psychological inversion is perhaps their greatest achievement. They've managed to make their victims feel virtuous about participating in their own oppression and guilty about any impulses toward freedom or self-determination. They've turned the human conscience into a weapon against human liberty. The mechanism they use to maintain this inversion is what psychologists call moral loading, the association of their policy objectives with values that people genuinely care about. Support for digital currencies becomes care for the environment. Acceptance of surveillance becomes protection of children. Submission to unelected authorities becomes defense of democracy. The specific policies don't matter as much as the emotional associations that surround them. Once people have been conditioned to view resistance as morally suspect, the actual content of what they're being asked to accept becomes almost irrelevant. The psychological framework does the work of enforcement, making external coercion unnecessary in most cases. This is why their messaging always emphasizes collective responsibility, shared sacrifice, and the greater good. It's why individual rights are consistently portrayed as selfish luxuries that civilized people must be willing to surrender for the benefit of others. Is why any assertion of personal autonomy is immediately reframed as an attack on community solidarity. They've successfully convinced large portions of the population that freedom itself is antisocial, that privacy is suspicious, and that independence is a form of extremism. They've made people ashamed of the very impulses that could save them from the trap that's being constructed around them. But this psychological manipulation strategy depends entirely on maintaining the illusion that the authorities implementing these changes are legitimate, competent, and acting in good faith. And that illusion is becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as the gap between their promises and their performance becomes impossible to ignore. The same officials who claimed their emergency measures would be temporary have been extending them indefinitely. The same experts who promised their solutions would solve the problems have been moving the goalposts every time their predictions failed to materialize. The same institutions that demanded trust have been caught lying, manipulating data, and suppressing information that contradicts their narratives. Each broken promise, each exposed deception, each failed prediction chips away at the credibility that their entire operation depends on. And once that credibility is lost, once people stop believing that the authorities are acting in their best interests, the psychological frameworks that make voluntary compliance possible begin to collapse. This is why we're seeing increasingly desperate attempts to silence dissent, suppress alternative information, and criminalize questioning of official narratives. They know their window of opportunity is closing, that their credibility is evaporating, and that they may only have a short time left to implement the technological control systems that would make future resistance impossible. The transition from psychological control to technological control represents the final phase of their strategy. Once they have the ability to monitor thoughts directly, restrict behavior through programmable currencies, and modify neural activity through brain-computer interfaces, they won't need to maintain public trust or manufacture consent. They'll be able to impose their will directly, regardless of what people think or feel about it. The infrastructure for these systems is being built right now under the guise of convenience, security, and public health. Brain implants are being marketed as medical devices for treating depression and neurological disorders. Digital currencies are being promoted as solutions to financial inequality and environmental problems. Social credit systems are being introduced as ways to improve public safety and reward good citizenship. Each system appears beneficial when considered in isolation, but when combined and scaled to cover entire populations, they create a comprehensive control apparatus that would make traditional authoritarian regimes look primitive by comparison. The same technologies that promise to heal your brain could be used to control your thoughts. The same digital currencies that offer financial inclusion could be programmed to restrict your purchases based on your compliance with approved behaviors. The same social credit systems that reward good citizenship could define good citizenship in ways that eliminate any possibility of dissent or resistance. And once these systems are fully deployed, once they become the default infrastructure that everyone depends on for basic services, opting out becomes practically impossible. You can't function in a digital economy without digital currency. You can't access medical care without the implants that monitor your health. You can't participate in society without the social credit scores that determine your access to employment, housing, and transportation. The transition happens gradually, through the same incremental process that has characterized all of their major initiatives. First, the systems are optional conveniences that make life easier for early adopters. Then they become necessary tools for accessing certain services or opportunities. Finally, they become mandatory requirements for participation in normal economic and social activities. By the time people realize what they've accepted, By the time the full implications become clear, the infrastructure is already in place and the alternatives have been eliminated. Resistance requires rejecting not just specific policies, but entire technological systems that have become integrated into every aspect of daily life. This is the trap that's being constructed around us right now. Not a traditional prison with walls and guards, but a technological web that makes freedom literally unthinkable by eliminating the practical means of exercising it. They don't need to convince you that slavery is good. They just need to make slavery feel like the only viable option in a world where all the alternatives have been systematically eliminated. The timeline for completing this transition is accelerating rapidly. The pilot programs are expanding, the legal frameworks are being established, and the social conditioning is intensifying. What once seemed like distant possibilities are becoming immediate realities as the infrastructure reaches the point where full deployment becomes technically feasible. But their accelerated timeline also creates vulnerabilities that didn't exist during their more gradual historical operations. The faster they move, the more obvious their coordination becomes. The more systems they try to implement simultaneously, the greater the chance that technical failures or social resistance will disrupt their plans. The more pressure they apply, the more people begin to notice that something isn't right. The same urgency that drives them to push harder also makes them more likely to make mistakes, expose connections, and reveal objectives that they would have preferred to keep hidden until the transformation was complete. Their desperation is becoming visible to anyone who knows what to look for, and that visibility is waking up people who might otherwise have remained passive observers. The question is whether this awakening is happening fast enough to prevent the implementation of control systems that would make future resistance impossible. The answer depends largely on how effectively people who understand what's happening can communicate that understanding to others, and how courageously those others are willing to act on that knowledge, despite the personal costs involved. The battle lines are being drawn right now in this moment through conversations like this one. Every person who chooses to see clearly rather than look away, every individual who decides to speak truth rather than remain silent, every human being who refuses to participate in their own enslavement makes their job just a little bit harder. They've spent 3,000 years building toward this moment, but they've never faced a generation with access to the information, tools and communication networks that exist today. They've never had to implement their final phase under the scrutiny of populations that can document their activities, analyze their methods, and share their findings in real time. For the first time in recorded history, the controllers are operating in an environment where their actions can be observed, their communications can be intercepted, and their plans can be exposed before implementation is complete. The same technologies they're using to monitor and control populations also create opportunities for those populations to monitor and expose them. The advantage is shifting, but it's shifting slowly, and time is running out. The window for effective resistance is measured in years, not decades. The infrastructure they need to complete their transformation is approaching operational readiness. The social conditioning required to ensure acceptance is nearly complete. The legal and regulatory frameworks necessary to enforce compliance are being finalized. We're living through the most critical period in human history, the moment when our species will either preserve its capacity for self-determination or surrender it permanently to forces that view freedom as an obstacle to efficient management. The choice is still ours to make, but only if we make it soon, and only if we're willing to accept the responsibilities that come with choosing difficult truth over comfortable lies. The storm they've been building toward for 3 millennia is about to break. The only question is whether you'll be ready for it when it arrives, or whether you'll be swept away like everyone else who refused to see it coming until it was too late. But there's something else you need to understand before you decide how to respond to this information. Something that changes everything about how we should interpret their actions and what their ultimate objectives might actually be. Because what if everything I've told you so far is exactly what they want you to believe? What if the very act of revealing their ancient conspiracy serves purposes that go far deeper than simple truth-telling? What if the real secret isn't that they've been controlling human civilization for 3,000 years, but that they've been preparing for something that's about to happen? Something that makes all of their historical manipulations look like mere practice exercises for the main event that's finally approaching? The documents I'm about to share with you suggest that their 3 Millennium project wasn't designed to create permanent control over human populations. It was designed to prepare those populations for a transition so fundamental, so unprecedented, that it will make everything we think we know about reality seem like a preliminary phase in a much larger process. And if that's true, if their actual objectives are something far more ambitious than simple world domination, then everything we've discussed takes on an entirely different meaning. The question isn't whether we can stop them from completing their plan. The question is whether we're ready for what that plan was actually designed to accomplish. The final revelation is going to change everything you thought you understood about their motives, their methods, and the true nature of the reality we're all living in. But once you see it, once you understand what they've actually been building toward, you'll realize that the choice facing humanity isn't between freedom and slavery. It's between evolution and extinction, and the timeline for making that choice is running out faster than anyone realizes. The chamber beneath the Vatican archives is silent at 3 a.m, its climate-controlled environment preserving documents that were never meant to see daylight. In 2019, Dr. Elena Vasquez, a paleolinguist with unprecedented access to restricted papal collections, made a discovery that shattered her understanding of human history. Hidden within a medieval manuscript describing routine monastery finances, she found margin notes written in a script that predated known written language by thousands of years. The symbols weren't random scratches or decorative flourishes, they were mathematical equations describing orbital mechanics with a precision that wouldn't be achieved by mainstream science until the space age. But here's what made her hands shake as she photographed those ancient calculations. The equations weren't just describing planetary movements, they were predicting them. Specifically, they were calculating the approach of an object from outside our solar system, with an arrival date that corresponds exactly to astronomical observations being made by modern telescopes right now. Dr. Vasquez spent months trying to debunk her own discovery, seeking any explanation that would allow her to dismiss what she was seeing. Carbon dating confirmed the manuscript's medieval origins. Spectral analysis verified the age of the inks used for the margin notes. Linguistic analysis confirmed that the script belonged to no known ancient language, yet followed mathematical principles that remained consistent across dozens of similar documents she began finding in archives around the world. What she had stumbled upon wasn't just evidence of ancient astronomical knowledge, it was proof of a communication network that had been operating across millennia, passing down information about an event that wouldn't become visible to modern telescopes until our current generation. The same symbols appeared in Sumerian tablets, Egyptian tomb inscriptions, Mayan codices, and even carved into stones at sites like Stonehenge and Easter Island. Each location, each culture, each time period had preserved pieces of the same message: coordinates, dates, and instructions for preparations that needed to be completed before a specific celestial event occurred. The mathematical precision was so exact that Dr. Vasquez could use the ancient calculations to predict astronomical phenomena with greater accuracy than modern computer models. But the most disturbing aspect of her discovery wasn't the impossible knowledge demonstrated by these ancient sources. It was the realization that every major historical event we've discussed, every war, every revolution, every social transformation, every technological advancement, had been timed according to a countdown that was leading to this single moment in history. The organization we've been investigating wasn't trying to control human civilization for its own sake. They were trying to prepare it for something that required a specific level of technological capability, social organization, and psychological conditioning to survive. Every manipulation, every deception, every system of control had been designed to ensure that when this moment arrived, human populations would be ready to respond in ways that maximized their chances of survival. Think about the technologies that have emerged in just the past few decades. Global communication networks that can coordinate responses across the entire planet within seconds. Transportation systems that can move massive populations quickly and efficiently. Medical technologies that can treat injuries and diseases on an unprecedented scale. Energy systems that can power industrial operations independent of traditional resources. None of these developments happened by accident. None of them emerged through random market forces or natural innovation cycles. They were all guided into existence by the same coordinating intelligence that has been shaping human development for millennia, timed to reach operational readiness exactly when they would be needed most. The surveillance systems that seem designed to oppress populations are actually designed to monitor their readiness for rapid mobilization. The financial control mechanisms that appear to concentrate wealth are actually designed to coordinate resource allocation during emergency conditions. The social conditioning programs that seem to reduce individual freedom are actually designed to ensure collective response capabilities when individual decision-making becomes inadequate for survival. But survival of what exactly? What could require such elaborate preparation across such vast spans of time? The answer lies in those ancient calculations that Dr. Vasquez discovered, and in astronomical observations that are being made right now by telescopes around the world. Their findings classified at levels that most government officials don't even know exist. The object approaching our solar system isn't a natural celestial body following predictable orbital mechanics. It's something that demonstrates characteristics suggesting artificial construction, intentional trajectory adjustment, and response patterns that indicate some form of guidance system. Its approach vector and timing correspond exactly to the ancient predictions, but its behavior suggests capabilities that challenge our understanding of physics and engineering. Modern astronomical observations have detected electromagnetic signatures emanating from this object that match no known natural phenomena. Radio telescopes have recorded structured signals that appear to contain mathematical sequences and geometric patterns. Most disturbing of all, the object's trajectory has been observed to change in ways that suggest it's actively adjusting its approach to ensure arrival at the precise location and time predicted by calculations that were carved into stone thousands of years ago. The implications are staggering when you consider what this means about the true nature of human history. If ancient civilizations had access to information about this object's approach, if they were able to calculate its arrival with perfect accuracy, if they were sophisticated enough to begin preparations that would span millennia, then everything we've been taught about the development of human knowledge and capability is fundamentally wrong. But there's something even more disturbing about this revelation. The ancient sources don't just describe the object's approach, they describe what happens when it arrives. And according to those sources, this isn't the first time it's visited our solar system. The calculations suggest a regular cycle, an orbital pattern that brings this object back to our vicinity every few thousand years. Each previous visit, according to the ancient records, coincided with major evolutionary leaps in human development. The emergence of agriculture, the rise of civilization, the development of written language, the advancement of mathematics and astronomy. All of these breakthroughs happened during or shortly after periods when this object was present in our solar system. The record suggests that each visit brings what the ancient sources describe as gifts of knowledge, information transfers that accelerate human development in ways that wouldn't be possible through natural evolutionary processes. But they also describe trials of worthiness, tests that determine whether human populations are ready to receive more advanced knowledge and capabilities. This is why the secret organization we've been investigating has been so obsessed with controlling and guiding human development. They weren't trying to dominate our species for selfish purposes. They were trying to ensure that when the next visit occurred, when the next round of tests and knowledge transfers began, human civilization would be sophisticated enough to survive the process and benefit from what was being offered. The technological control systems they're implementing aren't designed to oppress human populations permanently. They're designed to coordinate responses during a period of contact and evaluation that requires levels of global organization and resource management that have never been necessary before in human history. The psychological conditioning programs aren't meant to eliminate individual freedom forever. They're meant to prepare populations for experiences that would be psychologically devastating if encountered without proper preparation. The ancient sources describe previous contact events in terms that suggest massive disruptions to normal consciousness, reality perception, and social functioning. But here's where the revelation becomes truly terrifying. The ancient sources also describe what happens to civilizations that fail the trials, populations that aren't ready for contact, societies that can't handle the knowledge transfers or maintain stability during the evaluation process. They don't get destroyed or eliminated, they get reset. Archaeological evidence suggests that human civilization has been through this cycle multiple times before. Advanced societies that reached high levels of technological and social development then suddenly collapsed and disappeared, leaving behind only fragments and ruins that don't fit the official timeline of human progress. Atlantis, Lemuria, the advanced civilizations hinted at in ancient texts from around the world, they may all be memories of previous cycles that ended in reset events. The organization controlling our current civilization knows this history, because they've preserved records from previous cycles. They understand that the approaching object brings both unprecedented opportunities and existential risks. They've spent 3,000 years preparing for this moment because they know it's humanity's next evolutionary test, and they know what happens to species that fail. This is why their timeline is accelerating so rapidly right now. The object's approach is entering its final phase, and the window for completing preparations is closing. Every system needs to be operational, every population needs to be conditioned, every resource needs to be positioned correctly before contact occurs. There's no opportunity for gradual implementation or extended testing periods. The same astronomical observations that revealed the object's artificial characteristics have also detected changes in its behavior that suggest the contact phase is beginning. Electromagnetic emissions are intensifying, trajectory adjustments are becoming more frequent, and new types of signals are being detected that weren't present during earlier phases of the approach. But perhaps most significantly, similar objects are being detected in other star systems, following patterns that suggest a coordinated operation spanning multiple worlds and civilizations. What we're experiencing isn't unique to Earth. It's part of a much larger process that appears to involve entire regions of the galaxy. The organization that has been guiding human development for millennia isn't just working with knowledge passed down from previous cycles. They're in communication with intelligences that coordinate these contact events across multiple worlds, receiving instructions and guidance that help them prepare their assigned populations for what's coming. This is why their symbols and practices trace back to astronomical observations and mathematical principles that seem impossibly advanced for their supposed time periods. They weren't developing this knowledge independently. They were receiving it from sources that understand the contact process from direct experience spanning many worlds and many cycles. The secret meetings, the hidden communications, the coded messages that have puzzled researchers for centuries weren't just coordination between human conspirators. They were communications with non-human intelligences that have been overseeing the preparation process and providing guidance on how to successfully navigate the coming transition. But here's what makes this revelation both hopeful and terrifying at the same time. The fact that such elaborate preparations are being made suggests that success is possible. Previous cycles have produced civilizations that passed their tests, received their knowledge transfers, and evolved to higher levels of capability and consciousness. The process isn't designed to eliminate species, it's designed to elevate them. However, the preparations also suggest that failure carries consequences beyond simple extinction. The reset events described in ancient sources don't just eliminate advanced civilizations, they alter the fundamental parameters of reality for the populations that survive. Physics, consciousness, social organization, even biological processes can be modified to create starting conditions for the next developmental cycle. This means that the stakes of our current moment extend far beyond political freedom or economic prosperity. What's being determined right now is the basic nature of reality that future generations will inhabit. The choices being made, the systems being implemented, the responses being prepared will influence not just how we experience the contact event, but what kind of existence becomes possible afterward. The technological control systems aren't just tools for managing populations during the transition period. They're interfaces that will determine how human consciousness connects with whatever intelligence is approaching our world. The psychological conditioning programs aren't just preparation for social disruption, they're training for types of mental and emotional experiences that have no precedent in normal human experience. The financial and political centralization isn't just about concentrating power in human hands, it's about creating decision-making structures that can interface effectively with intelligences that operate on completely different timescales and priority systems than anything we've encountered before. Everything we've interpreted as oppression or manipulation takes on a completely different meaning when viewed as preparation for contact with intelligences that could transform human civilization beyond recognition, or eliminate it entirely depending on how successfully we navigate the evaluation process. But this revelation also explains why resistance to their control systems has been increasing so rapidly in recent years. Some part of human consciousness, some deep instinctual awareness, recognizes that fundamental changes are approaching and rebels against preparations that feel wrong or dangerous even when their stated purposes sound reasonable. The awakening that's happening around the world isn't just people becoming aware of political conspiracies or economic manipulation. It's a species-level response to approaching contact, an evolutionary alarm system that activates when populations sense they're being prepared for something that their controllers won't fully explain. This instinctual resistance may actually be part of the test. The willingness to question authority, to demand transparency, to insist on understanding rather than blind compliance, could be precisely the qualities that determine whether a civilization is ready for advancement to higher levels of development and consciousness. The ancient sources suggest that species which passively accept preparation without understanding, populations that submit to control without questioning its purposes, civilizations that prioritize safety over freedom, consistently fail their evaluation periods. The intelligences conducting these tests appear to value independence, curiosity, and courage more than compliance, efficiency, or social stability. This creates a profound paradox for the organization that's been guiding our development. They need to prepare populations for contact, but they also need to preserve the qualities that make successful contact possible. Too much control eliminates the independence that's being tested. Too little control leaves populations unprepared for experiences they can't handle. The balance they're trying to achieve may be impossible to maintain, which could explain why their methods are becoming increasingly desperate and obvious. They're running out of time to complete preparations while also running out of ways to maintain control without destroying the very qualities that their preparations are supposed to preserve. The accelerating awakening, the increasing resistance, the growing awareness of manipulation and deception, all of these developments could be signs that their approach is fundamentally flawed, that they're trying to solve an impossible equation that has no solution within the parameters they've established. But they may also be signs that the preparation process is working exactly as intended, that human populations are developing the awareness, courage, and independence needed to navigate contact successfully, regardless of whether they trust or cooperate with the systems that have been guiding their development. The approaching object, the ancient predictions, the technological preparations, the social conditioning, the psychological awakening, all of these elements are converging toward a moment that will determine not just the future of human civilization, but the basic nature of reality itself for our species. We're not just facing a political crisis or an economic transition or a social transformation. We're facing an evolutionary test that will determine whether humanity graduates to a higher level of existence or gets reset to begin the developmental cycle again with modified parameters and different possibilities. The choice isn't between freedom and slavery, between resistance and compliance, between truth and deception. The choice is between conscious participation in our own evolution or unconscious subjugation to processes we don't understand and can't control. But to make that choice effectively, to navigate this transition successfully, we need to understand not just what's being done to us, but what's being done for us. We need to recognize not just the dangers of the control systems being implemented, but the reasons why those systems might be necessary for survival during contact. Most importantly, we need to distinguish between preparations that serve humanity's evolutionary interests and manipulations that serve only the interests of those doing the preparing. Because not everyone involved in this process has humanity's best interests at heart, and not all of the preparations being made are designed to help us succeed in our upcoming evaluation. The organization that's been guiding human development for millennia has been infiltrated by factions with different objectives, competing agendas, and conflicting theories about how the contact process should be managed. Some genuinely want to help humanity evolve to higher levels of consciousness and capability. Others want to maintain control regardless of what that means for our species' long-term development. Still, others have objectives that may not be compatible with human survival at all. The battle that's really being fought right now isn't between humans and their controllers, it's between different factions of controllers with radically different ideas about what humanity should become and how the transition should be managed. The resistance that's emerging among human populations is being supported by some factions while being opposed by others. This means that the awakening happening around the world isn't just a spontaneous human response to manipulation. It's being guided and amplified by forces that want to ensure humanity develops the awareness and independence needed for successful contact, even if that means disrupting control systems that other forces consider essential for managing the transition safely. The information you're receiving right now, the revelations about ancient conspiracies and modern manipulation, the exposure of hidden agendas and secret operations, all of this could be part of a deliberate disclosure process designed to prepare populations for truths that will become impossible to hide once contact begins. But it could also be psychological warfare designed to create confusion, fear, and conflict during a period when unity and stability are essential for survival. The same information that helps some people prepare effectively for what's coming could paralyze others with anxiety or radicalize them into responses that make successful contact less likely. The challenge facing every individual right now is learning to distinguish between information that serves their evolutionary development and information that serves someone else's agenda. The tools for making that distinction exist within human consciousness itself, but they require levels of discernment, intuition, and inner knowing that most people have been conditioned to ignore or dismiss. The approaching contact event will test not just our technological capabilities and social organization, but our capacity for conscious choice in environments of extreme uncertainty and unprecedented change. The populations that navigate this transition successfully will be those that learn to trust their deepest wisdom while remaining open to possibilities beyond their current understanding. The ancient sources suggest that contact events are simultaneously the most dangerous and most beneficial experiences that developing civilizations encounter. They represent opportunities for evolutionary leaps that would otherwise take millions of years to achieve naturally. But they also represent existential risks that can end developmental cycles permanently, if not handled with sufficient wisdom and courage. The preparations being made right now will determine which outcome we experience. But those preparations aren't just technological systems and social structures. They're also the consciousness, awareness, and inner development of the individuals who will need to make critical choices during moments when the future of our species hangs in the balance. The secret organization that's been guiding human development for 3 millennia has understood this from the beginning. Their most important work hasn't been building control systems or accumulating power. It's been preserving and transmitting the knowledge that individuals need to navigate contact successfully when the time comes. That knowledge is encoded in the same symbols, practices, and traditions that have puzzled researchers for centuries. But it's not meant to be understood intellectually or decoded academically. It's meant to be absorbed at levels of consciousness that activate automatically when the right conditions are present. This is why their methods have always seemed so mysterious and indirect. They're not trying to control behavior through conscious understanding. They're trying to prepare consciousness itself for experiences that transcend normal human categories of thought and perception. The technological control systems, the social conditioning programs, the psychological manipulation techniques. These are just the surface level of a preparation process that operates primarily through mechanisms that most people aren't even aware they possess. The real preparation is happening in the depths of human consciousness, in dimensions of awareness that connect directly to the intelligences approaching our world. The awakening that's occurring right now is actually contact beginning, the first phase of an interaction that will transform everything we think we know about reality, consciousness, and our place in the universe. But that transformation can only occur successfully if human populations maintain their capacity for conscious choice throughout the process. The moment we surrender that capacity, the moment we allow fear or confusion or desperation to override our inner wisdom, we fail the test that determines whether we evolve or get reset. The approaching object, the ancient preparations, the modern control systems, the psychological awakening, all of these are elements in a process that's been unfolding for thousands of years and is now reaching its culmination. What happens next depends entirely on how well we've learned the lessons that have been embedded in human experience since the beginning of recorded history. The choice is ours, but the window for making it consciously is closing rapidly. The moment of contact is approaching, and when it arrives, we'll discover whether 3,000 years of preparation have made us ready for the greatest opportunity and the greatest challenge our species has ever faced. The question isn't whether you believe what I'm telling you. The question is whether you're prepared to trust your deepest knowing when everything you thought you understood about reality begins to change. Because that moment is coming sooner than anyone realizes, and when it arrives, the only thing that will matter is whether you maintain the courage to choose consciously in the face of the impossible. The storm that's been building for millennia is about to break, and in its aftermath will either emerge as something greater than we ever imagined possible, or we'll begin the cycle again with no memory of what we lost. The choice is yours, but you have to make it now while choice is still possible. Human consciousness stands at the threshold of its greatest test. The outcome will determine not just our future, but the very nature of what it means to be human in a universe far stranger and more wondrous than we've dared to imagine. The revelation is complete. The preparation is finished. The moment of truth is approaching. Are you ready? The silence that follows revelation is always the heaviest. You've just absorbed information that fundamentally alters your understanding of everything. Human history, the nature of reality, the approaching convergence that will determine our species' fate. But here's what's going to happen next, and it's something that every person who encounters this truth must face. Your mind is going to rebel. Over the coming hours and days, you'll find yourself desperately searching for ways to dismiss what you've learned, to find flaws in the logic, to discover explanations that allow you to return to the comfortable certainty of your previous worldview. This isn't weakness, it's a natural psychological defense mechanism, against information that threatens the foundations of everything you thought you knew. But that rebellion is exactly what they're counting on. The same forces that have spent millennia perfecting methods of control have also perfected methods of making their most dangerous truths feel impossible to accept. They've weaponized your own rationality against you, making the evidence of their activities seem too extraordinary to believe even when it's hiding in plain sight. Consider this. Every major paradigm shift in human understanding has been initially rejected by the very people who would benefit most from accepting it. The idea that the Earth orbits the Sun was considered absurd madness by the most educated minds of its time. The existence of germs was dismissed as fantasy by medical professionals who were unknowingly killing patients through ignorance. The possibility of powered flight was ridiculed by scientists right up until the moment the Wright brothers proved them wrong. The pattern repeats because human consciousness is designed to resist information that requires fundamental changes in behavior, belief, or identity. Your mind will generate every possible alternative explanation, every conceivable reason to doubt, every imaginable justification for dismissing what you've learned and returning to the safety of conventional thinking. But here's what's different about this particular revelation. You don't have the luxury of gradual acceptance over generations. The timeline we're operating on is measured in years, not centuries. The approaching convergence won't wait for human psychology to catch up with human necessity. The choices that determine our species' future must be made by people who are willing to act on information they're not completely comfortable believing. This is the first test of your readiness for what's coming. Can you hold space for possibilities that challenge your fundamental assumptions about reality? Can you make decisions based on pattern recognition rather than absolute certainty? Can you trust your deeper knowing even when your rational mind is screaming that you're being deceived? The ancient sources describe this psychological crisis as inevitable for individuals who encounter advanced knowledge during preparation phases. They call it the breaking of the comfortable chains, the moment when consciousness must choose between the safety of familiar limitations and the terror of unlimited possibility. Every person who has ever played a significant role in humanity's evolutionary development has faced this same choice. Every individual who's ever contributed to genuine progress in science, philosophy, or social organization has had to act on information that their contemporaries considered impossible or dangerous. The difference is that previous generations could afford to take decades working through their doubts and fears. They had time to test their insights gradually, to build evidence slowly, to convince others through careful demonstration rather than urgent revelation. You don't have that luxury. The infrastructure for technological control is approaching operational readiness. The social conditioning programs are entering their final phases. The astronomical timeline is accelerating beyond the point where gradual awakening remains viable. The window for conscious choice is closing whether you're ready for it or not. This is why the information you've received feels so overwhelming, so urgent, so demanding of immediate response. It's not because those delivering it are trying to manipulate you into hasty decisions. It's because the approaching convergence has compressed the normal timeline for psychological integration into a period that feels impossibly brief. But here's what might help you navigate this compression. You don't need to believe everything you've learned in order to act appropriately on what you've learned. You don't need absolute certainty about ancient conspiracies or extraterrestrial contact to recognize that fundamental changes are occurring in your immediate environment. Look around you. Observe what's actually happening in your world without trying to fit it into the explanations you've been given by authorities or the theories you've encountered in alternative sources. Trust your own perception of the patterns, the acceleration, the coordination that's becoming visible to anyone willing to see clearly. The technological systems being implemented are real, regardless of who's implementing them or why. The social changes occurring are observable, regardless of whether they're organic developments or orchestrated manipulations. The psychological pressure you're feeling is genuine regardless of its ultimate source or purpose. You can respond appropriately to these realities without needing to resolve every question about their deeper significance. You can take steps to protect your autonomy, preserve your options, and maintain your capacity for conscious choice without having complete understanding of why those steps are necessary. The ancient wisdom traditions understood this principle perfectly. They taught people to navigate uncertainty through attention to immediate experience rather than attachment to conceptual understanding. They developed practices that strengthened consciousness itself rather than filling it with specific beliefs or expectations. This is the kind of preparation that remains relevant regardless of which version of future events actually unfolds, whether the approaching changes represent evolutionary opportunity or existential threat, whether they're guided by benevolent intelligence or manipulative control, whether they lead to transcendence or catastrophe. Your ability to respond consciously will determine your experience of whatever occurs. The specific details of the conspiracy, the exact nature of the approaching object, the precise timeline of contact events. These things matter less than your capacity to remain centered, aware and responsive in environments of extreme uncertainty and rapid change. But that capacity requires practice, and practice requires starting now, while the conditions are still relatively stable and the choices are still relatively clear. Every day you delay beginning this inner preparation is a day when your options become more limited and your responses become more reactive. The external systems of control gain power over you only to the extent that you remain unconscious of your own capacity for conscious choice. The technological monitoring becomes invasive only when you forget that your most important activities occur in dimensions of awareness that no technology can access. The social pressure becomes overwhelming only when you lose touch with the deeper currents of wisdom that flow beneath all human conditioning. This is why the most effective resistance to any form of control, whether ancient or modern, human or otherwise, begins with the development of inner sovereignty, not the ego's demand for independence, but consciousness itself, recognizing its own fundamental nature as the source of all experience rather than the victim of external circumstances. The approaching convergence will test this recognition under conditions more challenging than anything our species has previously encountered. The populations that navigate it successfully will be those who have learned to find their center in chaos, their clarity in confusion, their courage in uncertainty. These capacities can't be developed through intellectual understanding or emotional preparation alone. They require direct engagement with the deeper dimensions of consciousness that most people spend their entire lives avoiding or denying. The meditation practices preserved in ancient traditions, the contemplative methods developed by mystics and sages, the inner work techniques discovered by modern pioneers of consciousness exploration, all of these become critically relevant tools for navigating the transition ahead. But they're only effective if you begin engaging with them now, while you still have the mental space and emotional stability to establish consistent practice. Once the external pressures intensify, once the changes begin accelerating beyond your ability to track them cognitively, your responses will be determined by whatever level of inner development you've achieved before the crisis began. This is the most practical advice I can offer. Regardless of whether you believe anything about ancient conspiracies or approaching contact, begin immediately developing your capacity for conscious awareness under pressure. Learn to find stillness in motion, clarity in complexity, peace in uncertainty. The specific techniques matter less than the consistency of your engagement with them. Whether you choose traditional meditation, modern mindfulness practices, contemplative prayer, artistic expression, or direct inquiry into the nature of consciousness itself, what matters is that you begin and continue without interruption. The approaching convergence will overwhelm any preparation that depends entirely on external knowledge or circumstantial readiness. The only preparation that remains stable regardless of external conditions is the development of consciousness itself to the point where it can respond creatively to anything it encounters. This isn't spiritual bypassing or mystical escapism. It's the most practical possible preparation for a future that will demand levels of adaptability, discernment, and inner strength that have no precedent in normal human experience. The ancient sources that predicted our current moment also provided detailed instructions for individual preparation. But those instructions weren't meant to be followed blindly as prescribed practices. They were meant to point consciousness toward its own capacity for direct knowing, immediate wisdom, and spontaneous right action. The approaching test isn't about having the right information or making the correct choices according to some predetermined standard. It's about discovering your capacity to respond authentically from the deepest levels of your being when everything you thought you could depend on becomes unreliable. This discovery can only happen through direct engagement with uncertainty itself, through learning to find your way when all the familiar landmarks disappear, through developing trust in wisdom that emerges from beyond the thinking mind. The preparation is both urgent and patient, both immediate and eternal. It requires acting now while understanding that the real work happens in dimensions of time and space that operate according to principles completely different from those governing normal human activity. You are being prepared for something extraordinary, either the greatest opportunity or the greatest challenge your species has ever faced. The outcome depends not just on what you do, but on who you become in the process of doing it. The revelation is complete, the choice is yours, the time is now. But perhaps the most important thing to understand is that you're not facing this moment alone. The same awakening that's occurring in your consciousness is happening simultaneously in millions of others around the world. The same recognition of approaching change, the same urgent need for inner preparation, the same call to conscious participation in humanity's next evolutionary step. This isn't coincidence or mass hysteria. It's species-level intelligence activating in response to conditions that require collective wisdom and coordinated response. You're part of something much larger than individual awakening. You're part of consciousness itself preparing for transformation. Trust that, act on it, become worthy of it. The future of human consciousness depends on it.